time to talk now about Roman philosophy. What is Roman philosophy? It's very easy to dismiss it as entirely derivative, entirely derived from Greek thinking, from Greek thinkers. And of course that's true. But I think that there are two important things we should remember about what the Romans did with the Greek tradition of philosophy. First of all, they tended to combine it in new and interesting kinds of ways, producing combinations that were not just these Greek components all put together, but those components assembled with a new element and with a new cast, a new spin. Secondly, as I've remarked already, the Romans managed to spread Greek philosophy, finding for it an audience far wider than any of the Greek philosophers had originally expected, I think one can claim. The distinctive Roman style, which is what the Romans certainly can claim, or what we can claim for the Romans in philosophy, was a style which can be called syncretic, eclectic, synthetic. These three terms, which sound very much the same, but actually are really quite different. Taking elements from various Greek schools' traditions, the eclectic process, choosing from here and from there, Roman thinkers would synthesize the elements into what was a new compound, a new mixture. And this entire process of eclectic choosing and synthetic blending goes by the term syncretic, which I guess could be sort of a synonym for one or the other. No, it really can't be a synonym for one or the other. It has to be a description of the process involving these two steps, the eclectic and then the synthetic. If anything, Romans preferred broadly eclectic synthesis to the reviving a single philosophical tradition. From about the 2nd century BC onward, Greeks began to become Neo-Platonists or Neo-Aristotelians or Neo-Stoics or whatever, and to try to find the purity of that original tradition and to assert that, narrowing, if anything, the appeal of that tradition to a larger clientele. The Romans instead tried to combine them, not simply to combine, but to give a new character to that very combination. The most influential of the Roman syncretic philosophers was Marcus Tullius Cicero, born in 106 BCE and dying on the 7th of December BCE, a day which seemed to many conservative Roman intellectuals a day of infamy, even back in that year, not having to wait until 1941. Cicero was what they called a new man, a novus homo. He was not a member of the old Roman nobility. His family was quite distinguished as well as quite wealthy, but they were descended from kings of the Volscians to the southeast of Rome. At least they claimed to be descended from kings of the Volscians. And given the size of those populations and the stability of social structures in that part of the world at that time, it seems an entirely reasonable claim. The part of the world that he came from, the little town of Arpinum, the small city-state of Arpinum, on the slopes of the Italian mountains, sliding down into the Campania, the great flat plain south of Rome, was also home to Marius, Marius who would be the uncle-in-law of Julius Caesar, a man of modest origins who rose by talent to be the supreme commander of the Roman army and then consul half a dozen times in a row. In later centuries, that same stretch of country would be sought out by Benedict of Nursia when he founded the greatest of his monasteries in Monte Cassino, and in several centuries more to come, it would be the home of the family of Thomas Aquinas. So from Marius to Cicero to Benedict to Thomas Aquinas, that particular stretch of the Italian countryside has been extremely rich in thinkers and figures of ethical ideals. Cicero's parents sent him off to study rhetoric and politics in Rome, hoping that he would make for himself a political career. And then they sent him off to the east, to Athens and to Rhodes, where he loved to hear the lectures of the different clashing schools, not simply schools of rhetoric, but also schools of other kinds of philosophy as well. When he returned to Rome, finally, in his late 20s, about ready to start on a practical political career, he attached himself to the party of the optimates, the aristocratic party, especially to a faction within it which was derived from the Scipionic circle of the 2nd century BCE. The Scipionic circle gathering around the great Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus Africanus Numantinus, whose very name indicates his high standing in Roman society, a group which favored Stoicism, and especially not Stoicism alone, but Stoicism insofar as it could be blended with old native Roman traditions of patriotism and virtue. So we see already in the 2nd century BCE a tendency of the Romans to bring in this new philosophy, but not simply to copy it, to fuse it into something new with some native elements as well. While in Greece, Cicero had developed a particular interest in skeptic and in Epicurean philosophy. And in political life back home, he showed the same kind of tendency. He showed more sympathy for the popular concerns, for the concerns of the rival party of the Populares, than the right wing of his own party really liked. And he picked and chose various stances to take, trying to bring together again the various elements of his own party, as well as to find a kind of common ground, a central ground. So picking and choosing what seemed to him good ideas and good attitudes was simply his habit, his temperament, his personality, which expressed itself in the kind of eclectically synthesized philosophy which he was to contribute to the future. Now, no doubt Cicero's sense of the wisdom of eclecticism was heightened by the fact that during his lifetime, the Roman Republic was passing through its terminal phases of internal dissension, in fact, of dissolution. Civil war followed dictator, followed civil war, followed dictator, finally culminating, as we know, in the victory of Octavian, the nephew of Julius Caesar, over his enemies Brutus, and indeed over his first ally and then rival Mark Antony in 31 BCE. So, 12 years after Cicero's death, the process had come to its conclusion. Cicero was born knowing that it was already underway and was deeply distressed by that fact. Even if he had been the sort of person who would have preferred to hew to one or another traditional doctrine or traditional party, he saw that that was no longer possible. And if not possible, how could it be good? Cicero was at base a man of deep practicality, moral as well as political. His synthesizing eclecticism is most evident in his ethical doctrines. It's been remarked that he splits the difference between Epicurean ethics and Stoic ethics, and it's entirely fitting, entirely natural that he should split that difference. From Stoicism, Cicero drew the principle that virtue is sufficient for happiness. Indeed, virtue is happiness, whatever atrocities the external world inflicts upon us. And the external world was doing a very good job of inflicting atrocities, not simply on conquered subject populations, but on the aristocracy of the Roman Republic itself, the aristocracy that belonged to the party which at the moment was losing. Appropriate enough, Cicero felt pretty ill-treated by the Roman political class after he had reached the pinnacle of legitimate political power during his term as consul in the year 63 BCE. The consuls, as you will recall, were the chief executives of the Roman state. It was a dual executive, and consuls only ruled for 1 year. But during that year, they had extraordinary power. Cicero must have been aware that he got into office largely because of a serious split within his own party. He was a kind of compromise candidate who would not normally have been put forward for that office in the regular course of things. He felt that he was rather badly dumped by his party after many of his fellow party members failed to back him up in the attack upon him for dealing with the coup d'etat, the would-be coup d'etat of Catiline. And so Cicero retired from public life for 10 years. Then, in the course of those 10 years, he was invited by Julius Caesar to join the new triumvirate of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, and which was then going to take over. But Cicero refused to do that. He stayed in philosophical retirement, collecting more than 800 of the letters he'd written to friends and to family across the years, and continued to write as he edited this collection, and then composing a whole series of treatises on such philosophical topics, but practical philosophical topics, as old age, friendship, the nature of the gods, divination, and many other things as well. Then, after Caesar's assassination on the Ides of March of the year 44 BCE, Cicero briefly and brilliantly re-entered the political arena, now against Marcus Antonius, the ally of Caesar's nephew Octavian, who would go on to be called Augustus. Octavian imitated his adoptive father, his genetic great-uncle's policy of trying to win Cicero over, and Cicero was sympathetic to Octavian. Then, of course, when Octavian and Antony began to show signs of strain, Cicero focused his attacks upon Antony directly, and with tremendous courage, delivered a series of speeches in the Roman Senate attacking Antony, imitating the speeches of the great Athenian orator Demosthenes, who had the courage to speak up against Philip of Macedon several centuries before. Antony, understandably, hated Cicero at this point and ignored any of the appeals of Octavian for mercy for Cicero. He had Cicero killed and caused his tongue and his hands to be nailed to the rostrum, to the speaker's stand in the Roman Forum. Speaker's stand to which had been nailed the prows of captured Carthaginian warships long centuries before. From Epicureanism, Cicero drew the principle that the cultivation of refined and disciplined pleasure is not inconsistent with virtue. The Stoics had given Cicero a notion that virtue was its own reward, and since the reward he got in life was anything but comfortable, it was good that he held that doctrine. Although there was a certain unintended compliment when Antony had the tongue and the hands of this remarkably powerful speaker nailed to the speaker's stand, the speaker's platform, most available to the public in the capital city itself. From Epicureanism, by contrast, Cicero got the principle that virtue didn't have to be alone, that refined pleasure, disciplined pleasure, could be entirely consistent with virtue and were a valid source of happiness. To Cicero, rejecting such pleasure, which was certainly available to him as a highly educated and very rich member of the ruling circle of the world, to reject such pleasure seemed to him and to that whole tradition of ancient thought excessive, unnecessary. Discipline for the Epicureans certainly did not involve asceticism. They saw asceticism as irrational and unnatural. Cicero seems to have lived a life consistent with this balanced Stoic Epicurean principle of leading a life of pleasurable virtue and of virtuous pleasure. We know a good deal about his relationship with his wife, whom he deeply admired and to whom he felt very, very close indeed, relationship with his family. We have no evidence of his indulging in inappropriate relationships of any kind. We know that he treated his slaves with more kindness than was normal in that world. And at the very end, when Antony's assassins closed in upon him as he was trying to escape in his litter to a somewhat safer place, knowing probably there was no real point in this, his own slaves stood by him. Most unusual behavior in that world. It was a sign of the tremendous decency with which they had been treated by this Epicurean Stoic. Now, a similar combination of virtue and pleasure, and in fact a much more thoroughgoing synthesis of these two notions of happiness, occurs in the realm of political philosophy for Cicero. From Stoicism, Cicero drew a deep commitment to duty, practically to a form, a sort of subtype of philosophy, which some call deontology, from the Greek verb deo, meaning to owe, to have a duty. Our word due, of course, is closely related to deo. For Cicero, civic virtue was very simply deontology, civic deontology, obedience to duty, whatever the consequences. And in fact, as I mentioned, he had to face quite severe consequences at several times in his life, especially most brutally at the end. From Aristotle, however, Cicero drew certain thoughts which made the Stoic deontology to which he was attracted a good deal more pragmatic and, I think one has to say, attractive. For him, the kind of pragmatism that which he saw in Aristotle was not unprincipled. It was a more or less consistent blending of principles which were commonly dignified by the name of empiricism. Already people were speaking of the empiric approach to these matters. And empiricism is essentially what experience shows us actually works in a consistent manner. At least that's what Cicero's kind of empiricism was. The study of what actually works in a consistent manner in political life, for example, in civic life, which mattered to him most in this regard, and then the application of the results of that study to one's own behavior. A major influence on Cicero's practical empiricism was the great Greek diplomat, historian, and philosopher Polybius, born about 200 BCE and dying about 118 BCE. Polybius was a very patriotic Greek who came to Rome in the year 167 as a hostage. His particular faction in Greece had been defeated by the Roman general Aemilius Paulus at the Battle of Pydna. Pydna, in 167 BCE, gave Rome domination over the European part of the old Macedonian Empire, over the most Greek part of that Hellenistic empire, which had been dominating the Eastern Mediterranean since the death of Alexander the Great. He was, however, extremely well treated by the Romans, who respected him. The Romans tended to respect hostages and tried to cultivate hostages for later political connections. And Polybius became a member of the circle of Scipio, the man with the remarkable 6 names. He became a very respected member of the Scipionic circle, and entered the formal staff of Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus Africanus, who was given the title Africanus just like his adoptive grandfather, because of having finally defeated Carthage. And he was on Scipio's staff when Scipio went off to defeat the last significant rebellion against Roman rule in Spain, which ended up with the terrible siege of Numancia, and which victory added to his list of names, to his nomenclature, the title Numentinus. This extraordinary man, born about 185 BCE and dying in 129 after a relatively short life of 56 years, was the first official convert among the Roman upper class to Stoicism. And he also cultivated other kinds of culture, science, the arts, literature, and so on, poetry, from the Greek East, trying to convert them to Roman usage, sometimes having them translated into the Latin language, but at any rate trying to make good use of them for the Roman future. Polybius wrote a history, in a way the first comprehensive history ever written. By comprehensive I mean a history which takes account of events throughout the world that Polybius knew. From our point of view, of course, this is very Western. He's simply talking about the Mediterranean basin, but neither Herodotus nor Thucydides before, the 2 other historians of the same league as Polybius, had attempted to do anything like that. Polybius was absolutely fascinated by a 53-year period stretching from 220 BCE to 167 BCE, the date of the victory at Pydna. In 220, as he realized, Rome did not even control all of Italy. In 167, it controlled what Polybius called the whole world. Direct rule over the Asian coast and Egypt was not achieved until later, of course, until the days of Julius Caesar. But Rome didn't really need direct control. It had absolute dominance of those kingdoms as far as it desired it. Now, what could account for the incredible rise of this republic in the course of that half-century plus? Polybius goes back to recount the great stories of the Punic Wars. The wars in which the Carthaginians, called Puni by the Romans because they were Phoenician in origin, fought the Roman Republic. The great wars between the Scipio family and the family of Hannibal Barca. And Polybius shows that he is a master of military narrative. But the thing that really interests him, even more than the magnificent stories of Hannibal coming across the Alps with all of his elephants and so on, is the story of character. The character of commanders like the Scipios, like Hannibal and his heroic brothers and brothers-in-law. The characters also of the peoples that these commanders led. The Romans come in for much praise on that score from Polybius, because Roman character, Polybius felt, was of the sort that Rome could stand any kind of hardship and emerge victorious. In Book 6 of his histories, Polybius goes further. He gets more scientific, more strictly political, more, if you want, pragmatic in a philosophical way. And he sets out to explain Rome's success not just by its character, but also by its constitution, which he saw as a perfect example of the mixed government that Aristotle had pragmatically recommended, a combination of monarchy, of aristocracy, and of democracy. In the Roman case, the monarchy was the consulate, even though consuls reigned only for a year, and although there were 2 of them to check one another, their power was tremendous, and in certain moments could be as absolute as anything exercised by any Eastern tyrant. The monarchy was, of course, checked, balanced, and blended with by the Senate, from which, indeed, practically all of the consuls arose. And also, in the election to office, to any significant Roman office by the whole body of citizens, Polybius saw a form of democracy. And this was a democracy also conscious of its rights. Early on, the Romans had provided for the office of tribune, the tribune who was to protect the rights of the mass of the people. So in this blend of consular monarchy, senatorial aristocracy, and tribunal, if you want, tribunal democracy, Polybius saw Aristotle's practical political philosophy expressing itself in powerful and useful ways. Cicero agreed entirely, and he stated in his dialogue on the Republic that the Roman state, so constituted, had been the most perfect civil society in human history in the days of the magnificent grandfather of the Scipio he knew, even, indeed, into the days of the Scipio that Polybius had known, although Rome was beginning to slip at that point. Cicero's dialogue on the Republic is a fascinating work. He wrote it during his active political career, not during those 10 years of philosophical retirement at the end of his life. He sets it up as a dialogue among people who actually existed. Some of them people that he knew. And he tells us that he was told about the conversation of this dialogue by one of its youngest members when that person was an old man and governing a Roman province in Asia with such virtue and such dignity that the Asians couldn't believe it and the Romans couldn't believe it either. So what Cicero does is go back in time, back into the days of the great six-named Scipio, and tell about a conversation at Scipio's country estate. It's a conversation about what would be the most perfect form of government. What Cicero is trying to do in this dialogue is to set up a kind of an answer to Plato's Republic. He did not agree with Plato's Republic, nor did he agree entirely with the cosmopolitan vision of the Republic of Zeno. Instead, he proposes a republic, a res publica, which has existed in fact, and which during the long term of its existence was the most perfect state in human history, and the most perfect state that humans could probably ever dream of creating. In his own time, of course, in the time of the dissolution of the Republic, Cicero was very aware that that state no longer existed, or it existed legally, but in fact, in the sort of inner substance of its character and its moral machinery, it did not operate. Its institutional machinery was having trouble anyway, and its fundamental motivation structure was in terrible shambles indeed. This conversation goes on, and it ends with a fascinating, an absolutely fascinating passage in which Cicero just has recourse now to a myth. The myth which is called the dream of Scipio. Finally, Scipio's friends press him to tell about an extraordinary experience, an extraordinary out-of-body experience that he's mentioned to some of them, and he doesn't want to talk about. But then he does tell about it. And what Cicero is now doing here is creating a myth in the style of Plato, which is a myth meaning here a statement not in ordinary rational human speech, but a statement that goes beyond it into the higher reaches of the moral imagination. This is the most popular part of Cicero's dialogue in the Republic. In fact, the dialogue as a whole is in pieces, rather like the Roman state during the time that it was composed, and for quite a stretch after Cicero's own active period. But we do have, from the very end of it, the dream of Scipio, lovingly copied and recopied and spread throughout the body of medieval and Renaissance literature. In fact, Scipio's dream becomes a frequent reference. People like Chaucer and Dante can allude to it without telling you what they're talking about because they assume that their normal readership will understand the reference. In this dream, the younger Scipio Africanus, the man with the six names we've been talking about, is brought up to visit his dead grandfather, who is called merely Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus. Publius Cornelius Scipio, his proud Roman aristocratic name, Africanus, the epithet added when he had defeated the African empire of the Carthaginians. And what he does at this point is to, what Africanus does at this point is to show his grandson the world. He lifts the dreaming younger Africanus to a still point high above the earth from which they can survey the globe. To their eyes, Carthage, the old enemy, now restored, teems with busy commerce, as indeed it would in the later Roman Empire, when it would be refounded by the Romans who destroyed it. The younger Scipio destroyed it, absolutely, and then some years later was refounded as a Roman colony and would be the great cosmopolitan city of the world for such people as Augustine. The Roman Empire seems, including Carthage, seems to be quite puny indeed. We have a kind of view of the entire globe very much like the view of the globe, which Socrates talks about in his dialogue, the Phaedo. And we see the Romans, rather like Socrates' Greeks, are really inhabitants of only a small portion of it, although they think that they fill the globe with their own virtue and their own grandeur. The elder Africanus predicts the future, explains the nature of the universe, and reveals a very important doctrine which could not be determined or demonstrated by reason in the mind of Cicero or any of these other philosophers, but which can be revealed in this kind of mythic statement. He reveals that there is an afterlife of blessedness, which is reserved for those who practice virtue, civic virtue and interior virtue, to a heroic degree. The practice of virtue to a heroic degree gets you immortality. If you don't do that, you just vanish and disappear. There does not seem to be much in the way, if anything, in the way of an accompanying hell. There's been some disagreement about that, but that seems to be the direct message of the text simply read. So what we see here is an example of the reward for virtue, beyond virtue itself, and beyond the kind of disciplined and refined pleasure which the Epicurean tradition praised and which Cicero had tried to attach to Stoic devotion to virtue alone in his earlier thinking. Here he makes a religious statement that there is in fact a life of considerable blessedness for those who can combine pleasure and virtue in an appropriate way, provided they do it to a heroic degree. And I think it's kind of interesting that that very definition of the requirement for immortality is the definition which medieval Christianity will adopt for sainthood. A saint is someone who practices heroic virtue and is honored at the altar as a saint. This is the kind of an extension of Cicero's attempt to define what is the ultimate reward of virtue for his own pagan time. What a thought, practical thought for a disciplined elite whose virtue may achieve a reward even beyond victory and fame. And Africanus Elder and Africanus Younger had a good deal of both victory and fame. But here is a reward yet beyond it. And there was a philosophy, a kind of religious philosophy, which a practical Roman could appreciate and spread and preach and believe in. Obviously, this notion of the afterlife, of the blessed afterlife for the heroically virtuous, was not a philosophical claim. It could not be demonstrated according to natural reason as far as they were concerned, but it was a religious claim. It was a statement of revelation out of something rather like a pagan scripture. Cicero's influence on later periods of Western thought has been absolutely immense. From the 8th to the 12th centuries, the Carolingian period, and the first expansion of medieval West European culture, Cicero was the most respected, studied, and imitated classical thinker in Western Europe. When Charlemagne is trying to get his barbarian Franks to do a better job of ruling the great empire that has fallen to them, not only in terms of treating its subject peoples better, but of ruling the Frankish people with greater justice, he has people at his palace school teach him and his sons and their friends Ciceronic dialogues. And Alcuin, the Englishman brought in to improve the culture of all of the Carolingian Franks, has Charlemagne enter a dialogue with him. Charlemagne and his sons enter a dialogue about rhetoric, which is an effort to present to the Christian Franks the whole bundle of the teaching, the thought, and the example of Cicero. After taking backseat for a century and a half to Plato and Aristotle in philosophy, from, say, 1200 to about 1330, but never taking backseat as a model of Latin prose style, Cicero arose again as a dominant influence in the Renaissance, and his influence lasted brilliantly throughout the 17th and the 18th, and I think one could say the 19th centuries. He was seen for a very long time, up into the public schools of imperial England, as a perfect model for the cultivated gentleman, both in his forensic oratory and in his elegant but a concise prose style, and as a spokesman for an enlightened and polite personal ethic, which made him a good friend, a good husband, a good consul, a good diplomat, a good human being.